I think there's so many struggles going on right now that I really don't know which one to pick. I think one of the biggest ones today is the entire question of representation. I think that you find within the theatre as well as in the political sphere, where people feel no longer represented and start questioning. I don't want to put both on the same level, but there's a lot of questions finally on theatrical representation. For example, why is the community that you see outside, if you haven't been sleeping for the past century, not reflected on the stage? And I don't mean just like the classical discussion on the ensemble of the theatre should be more diverse, reflecting the diversity on the street. I really mean on a power structure level as well. I'm talking about directors, I'm talking about artistic directors. So that's one issue of representation. Then there's a lot of questions today, I think, around who can represent whom, and who can speak for whom, and who can speak with whom, and who can finally or is allowed within the space to speak for themselves. And then outside of the theatrical space, you have all of these questions today about what is representative democracy and why doesn't it work the way we expected it to work. So I think, the entire question around representative democracy is very much at stake right now, and it's very much being questioned. And I don't want to use like empty denominators like populism, kind of. But you do feel that a lot of people are once again experimenting with and wondering about different forms of leadership, often authoritarian forms of leadership. I worry about that. But I do agree there's a huge issue with representative democracy as it works today, which is way more of a partitocracy, as people call it, where you create a system which finally just leads to the system sustaining itself. And I completely understand why citizens feel no longer represented by the people they've chosen to represent them. And then we're not even talking about the question of who should be included within the system of representation, because now I'm just referring to citizens, but how do you deal with people who are not even granted citizenship? There's a huge population in Europe of people who are excluded of any kind of notion of citizenship, even though they are on the territory, and even though they're actually very much included in a system of capitalistic production, for example. Just think of illegalized laborers working in the south of Spain, or in Italy, or even Greece, who have no labor rights, etc., but who are tolerated, so to speak, within the territory in order to lower the prices, basically the production costs. But once they go to claim their wages, like in Manolada, for example, you can just shoot them basically because they have no labor rights. What do you do with the? I mean, what do you do with their position within the question of a representative democracy today? So I have a lot of questions around this. I'm sorry, and that's only one of the issues. There's so many I could talk about. Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I really do not believe in this kind of mechanical line between an art piece and effect or a change it institutes. I think we live very much in a time where art is being instrumentalized to create change. and where people more and more, if you want to get subventions, for example, if you want to get money, you have to prove the effect that the art piece will create. So I try to be weary of that. I do believe, however, that, I mean, to me, I know it sounds ridiculous, but sometimes it's really just about opening a window or something. A lot of the times during the preparations for Domo de Europa, Historia en Exilo, but also for Simplex ABC, which I'm working on right now, you notice that the academics I meet, or the policymakers, or suffer a chronicle lack of imagination. I think it's Zizek once paraphrased this sentence of it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And this was a bit the same thing for me in the interviews with a lot of the people I met. It was there was this complete incapability to imagine that the EU there was this complete incapability to imagine that the EU could ever end, or that it could even like go on a really completely different path. If you look at the white paper that the European Commission published recently about in which they detail five possible scenarios for the future of Europe, and then like predict where Europe is going to go. It's scenarios like, we will keep muddling through a bit and nothing is going to change much. There's a scenario like more integration, deeper integration, etc. There's a scenario where you have less cooperation and it's mainly the single market that still remains at the core of international cooperation, etc. There is not a single scenario within their entire futuristic plan that details a potential collapse of the EU. And I think you should really imagine or be able to imagine the end in order to avoid it. That first of all. And I think, like in the case of Domo, for example, the museum, I had to think a lot of this quote by Antonio Gramsci, the Italian activist, politician, philosopher, who wrote in his prison diaries that a crisis is a moment where the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And he writes within this interregnum, how does he write it, like an entire range of morbid symptoms appear or something. And I think it's a very good description of what a crisis is. And it really made me think of, okay, if the old is dying but the new cannot be born, like what could this museum that I create be? And then I thought of, well, if it's a mausoleum where we bury what might in the future remain of Europe, it's also a way of saying goodbye to the old so that the new can finally be born or something. So it goes back to this idea of opening a window, I think, and creating spaces of imagination. I think that whether you talk about documentary or fiction or whatever, I don't care. The crucial element of art, I think, remains changing images, proposing new imaginaries, and creating imagination. I think on the one hand, it really doesn't matter, because in Domo, when you visited, in Domo, when you visited, actually, the future is just a device. It's a mechanism. It's a pair of glasses through which we look at the present. So it's not a museum about the future. And of course, there are some predictions in it, etc. But they flirt with what you know or you do not know in order to trigger your imagination. But we do not give you like a scenario of what will happen in the course of the next 50 years. Also because we imagine that the fictional visitors of the museum in the future, in 2060 or something, they know what happened. You know what happened during the Second World War. It's usually the period before the interbellum that you know much less about. So we try to focus on the interbellum and not on the Third World War, which, according to some people, breaks out in 2052. But that's a whole other story. So yeah, of course, I worked a lot on like fictitious scenarios that influence the project, but they're not at the core of what I want spectators to see. But there's a lot of people experimenting right now with what another Europe could be, a Europe of cities, for example. There's a lot of experiments with the Parliament of Mayors, the regionalization of Europe, that kind of experiments. There are, I mean, the Mediterranean Union at some point was proposed by people like Sarkozy at some point. It is not something, it's not something new. The Mediterranean is a cultural space which has been defined by thousands of years of history of both trade, cultural exchange, tremendous unification violence, whether we talk about ancient Greece, Rome, whatever. So, yeah, anyway, it's leading me too far, I think. But yeah, Mediterranean Union might definitely be back on the table one day. Even though, like, the problem is always, like, weighing in the scenarios against each other. Because you could talk about a possible Mediterranean Union, but then that's only when you think about the geopolitical side of things. But then when you start thinking about the ecological side of things, for example, or the environmental side of things, you end up in a different discussion, because probably we can already see that a big part of the Mediterranean basin is desertifying at a tremendous speed. So probably a part of the Mediterranean will be a desert, and a part of the Mediterranean Sea will become a tropical hurricane basin, which makes a big part of the Mediterranean uninhabitable at some point in the future. So the question is really like, what kind of scenario do you weigh against another kind of scenario? So I try to hint at potential things, but it's really to reflect together on the present. Yes, in my mind a lot. I'm currently working on a series of works called Simple as ABC. It's a series of works I started around 2015, I think, but it goes back to other work I did. I've been doing it since 2009 or something. And Simple as ABC to me is a series of works that tries to tackle the apparatus of European, let's call it, mobility management. So what are the ways in which the European Union tries to, Arkady was just talking about that as well, facilitate specific types of mobility versus inhibit and illegalize other types of mobility. And I'm trying to zoom in on like different aspects, like Simple as ABC number 1, which was called Man versus Machine, was very much a zoom into the technological aspect of this mobility management, working on a device that was also invested in within the 7th framework program that Arkady talked about. It's called the electronic nose, and it's a device that at some point should replace border dog canine units in order to smell hidden people. So I worked on that, and then I recently, a year and a half ago, I made another play called Simple as ABC number 2, Keep Calm and Validate, which to me was very much a play on discourse, on the ideological shift that you see happening right now, and not only on the level of migration policy. It's a much more general shift towards datification. So it was a play about dataist ideology and this shift from human rights to what are now being called fundamental rights of data subjects. And yeah, I tried to make a play about this. So I did interviews with mainly data managers working within the field of migration, working in different European institutions and agencies. And then a composer set them to music and we sang them. It was a musical basically about policy discourse. And right now I'm working on number 3. Sometimes ABC number 3, which is called The Wild Hunt, and it's much more a play about, I think, the history of thoughts of or the construction of exclusion in the West. So it's much more about philosophical history, starting with a text by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who 2,400 years ago wrote in his Politica, he wrote a sentence about the fact that hunting is an art, just like war, that is to be practiced against wild animals and human beings who are predestined by nature to be dominated. And to me, it's like one of the first sentences in Western thought and history, which really lays the ground for both enslaving others, excluding others, hunting others, and it's really the precursor of a lot of writings that legitimize colonialism, for example, that legitimize slave trade, that legitimize. So I'm trying to work on this text and trying to work in different border areas together with people who are somehow involved in contemporary human hunt and reflect together on this text and their position within this hunt. There you go. Yeah, but I think you're making a huge shortcut there if you see it like that. You're talking about The Miracle of Almeria, right? The TV series that
Yes, The Miracle of Almeria.
So, first of all, just to frame it really correctly, it's being directed by Mon Blaise. She's a Dutch film director, so I'm not directing it, I'm co-directing it. And I'm focused, or my main focus was on the work within the scenes, and much less, Mon is much more involved in the entire creation process, so also doing the editing, the funding, etc. I just wanted to put that in perspective. No, so the process is not that we recreate a traumatic event and put people in this event. The process always starts with asking, with a meeting where we meet, I never call them actors, I never call them characters, I call them actors. They're actors with whom you establish a professional relationship. Even though the budget was very limited for this project, every time we work together with people, we try to pay them. So to me, it's really a relationship you establish where people bring in something and are paid for that. Even though I think within this project, it was much less than I hoped for, and I'm trying to, in my new project, trying to find more means to do that because I really want to take this seriously. So you establish a different kind of relationship and then you start working together, and it doesn't start from me or Mom deciding, okay, this is the scene we want to create, this is the traumatic event you went through, now we're gonna rebuild it, build a set, put you in it and see how you react. On the contrary, basically it starts from conversation with very open questions where we ask people, just to give one example, if you had a magical time machine and you could travel back to one point within the history of the region, what would you change? that's one of the questions. So they then decide on the moment, they decide on the scene, they decide on. So it's not a question about when did you feel powerless, for example, even though that is usually implied. It's also a question about what would you change. So it really makes a shift from a situation of powerlessness towards a situation of agency, where people can, even though it's a fictional pre-enactment or reenactment, you can institute a change. You can show the situation differently than how it was. So they decide on all of the elements, and then we do a counter proposal where we bring stuff in and we say like, okay, then maybe what do you think of this set? What do you think of? So it's really a collaborative process, and I think it's tremendously important that they have that the actors they have. I mean, that it's really a matter of shared authorship, and that they can decide what they want to do, what they are comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, what the text will be. It's really a collaborative process. So I don't think we have one scene, I think, or a few scenes where we recreate some kind of setting in which the actors interact, but then the setting and the scene that happens inside is decided by them, and it's often scenes that never happened in reality, for example. Because we really talked about how can you show a problem with let's say a position of powerlessness. How can you show a problem with power differentials? How can you shift the balance, even fictionally? How can you go back in time and show yourself the way you want to be shown, and do the actions you wish you could have done, you would like to do in the future, etc., etc. So it has nothing to do with the reenactment.